mean, what could be wrong with pointing to everything that's wrong in your life, every problem, and simply saying, the devil made me do it? Maybe you'd be like Cain and just mad at the world and the one who made it. Point to God and say, you know, God, why'd you make me this way? Why'd you allow me in this circumstance? How come you're not answering my prayer? The blame game starts by finding somebody else, whoever the somebody else might be. Next, be a victim. Throw yourself a pity party. Only problem with a pity party is nobody ever comes, right? Nobody loves me. Everybody hates me. It's not fair. It's not what I deserve. Exploit the sensitivity of those around you. Oh, it's natural for you to feel that way. Of course you do. No, you don't deserve this kind of stuff. Surround yourself with those affirming people, those who are willing to join your side of the blame game. Disable yourself, because that's what blame does, right? In other words, I want to, I just can't. It's all that I know. It's the best that I can do. The more of a victim that you become, the better you are at playing the blame game. And if you find that you're inadequate, watch TV. Especially those reality programs, especially those daytime talk shows, where they're going to tell you that everything you're feeling is all right. That's why you feel terrible, because you're in a terrible situation. In fact, one individual who's a master at the blame game said, try a lawsuit if you can. Sue somebody over it. You're the reason I'm this way. You're the reason this happened. You're the reason this. Go ahead and become the biggest victim you can. But if you really want to be successful at playing the blame game, take no responsibility for your actions. And by that, we might take a lead from a former president of ours who looked squarely into the eyes of the American people through a camera and denied blatantly the very thing that he knew he had done. He was so identified as an expert that they said he had Teflon on, and that whatever got slung at him just slid right off. Even if you're caught with your hands in the cookie jar, simply say, it's not my fault. Don't admit wrong. Don't admit a behavior. Don't say anything. In fact, one writer said that in his book about blame, he said, blame is an excuse for doing nothing. And the best way to do nothing is to take no responsibility whatsoever. I said it was the oldest game that has ever been played. We find the first occurrence of the game in Genesis chapter 3. And though some time has passed since God has created the world, we only have a couple of chapters before we arrive at this game-playing event. You know the story. God creates a world. God creates a world that's in every way perfect. He creates a world in which He is the only one that is required to sustain it. He creates a man and a woman named Adam and Eve. He places them in the garden, and He says, this is yours. You won't need to work. You won't need to sweat. There's no pain, there is no sorrow, there is no suffering, there is no sickness, there is no death. He didn't really say it that way, because if he had said, there is no sorrow, sickness, suffering, and death, Adam and Eve would have said, what's that? Because it didn't exist. Didn't exist in history. It didn't exist in their life. Everything is perfect. And he said, in fact, there's a tree here, tree of life. And later we find out, as God counsels with himself, that Adam and Eve could eat of that tree. Listen carefully. And they would live forever. And then there was one tree that was placed in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he says, but of that tree, you shall not eat, because of the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, I think we're all pretty clear that we're not very good at law keeping, because there's a lot of laws. I don't know if you know this, but currently you cannot lead cattle in this downtown city of Cleveland between the hours of 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. And that really messes up my schedule. I mean, there's laws for everything. There's laws about taillights. There's laws about headlights. There's all kinds of laws we got to follow. But we're not very good at that. I'm sure that we're all a little bit of lawbreakers. But that's understandable. There's a lot. We look at the Old Testament. Boy, they had some laws. At least over 600 that are written. That's a lot of laws. And one of them is don't eat shrimp. Y'all know Floyd's here? I broke the Old Testament law multiple times last night. I like shrimp. Now, I understand some of those other things aren't so good, but you know, Israel was terrible at that. But Adam and Eve, one law. That's it. The one law was don't eat of this tree. And so Adam and Eve lived happily ever after, forever. Not. Right? Eve looks at the tree. She sees that the tree is good for food. She believes that it will taste good. She only knows that because she's created that in her mind. You know, sometimes we want ourselves into needing something. And then she says, and if I eat that, I'll be wise. Now, that didn't come purely from her own consideration. She had a helper, a bit of an accomplice, and that was the devil, who took the form of a serpent and said, oh, whoa, 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 you misunderstood. He says, the day you eat of it, you will not die, but you'll be like God. It is here that we realize that Eve and her husband who was with her, I always have to get reminded of that. I always have to say this. I said, Adam had a little bit of a disadvantage. I mean, there's only one woman in the world who has been created exactly for him. She's beautiful. She's standing there, I don't mean to be inappropriate, but without a stitch of clothes on, and says, do you want to try some of this casserole? He had no choice but to say, yes. I'm just saying that. Be back for our marriage seminar when Tammy will rebut everything that I just said. But he did it too. And so for Adam and Eve, I wanted everything that they could need, and for that matter, even desire they had. Everything wasn't enough. They wanted more than everything, and ultimately it's going to cost them, and for that matter, all of us, a great deal. I want it, right? I want it. So God comes onto the scene as the story unfolds. He finds Adam and Eve, who have taken the first step in covering their sin by attempting to cover their sin. To hide out. I don't think it is a stretch for any of us to think in terms of, if we were guilty of something, that the first thing that we would do would be, let's not let anybody find out. We learned that as a kid, right? Just don't let mom find out. Don't let the teacher find out. Don't let the policeman find out. In other words, it can't be wrong. It can't be a sin. It can't be a crime if what? If nobody knows. So we won't find out. And God says, because guess what? You can't hide it from God. God said, have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat? Here's the point of that statement. God had clearly stated the instruction. He had made it clear that it was for Adam and Eve. In fact, we even know that Eve repeated this rule, this law, back to the serpent. And they disregarded that and did exactly what God told them not to do. Do you know what they call that? Guilty. They are guilty. There is no excuse. There is no reason. It is simply, I want and I did. So, Adam, second to eat but first to speak up, says what? The woman who you gave me. Do you understand where the blame's being put here? You might think that the blame is being put on the woman, but what? The woman that you gave me. The way you made me. The way that you caused it to happen. The way that you allowed it to happen. You knew in your divine ability to see the future, you knew good and well that she was going to do this, and she gave it to me. Fruit of the tree, and I ate it. Good supportive wife comes in. Oh, wasn't me. She just bats her eyes, right? Talks that soft. Not me. Really wasn't my fault. The devil made me do it. Because it doesn't really matter who you're talking to. It doesn't even matter who you're blaming. The objective of the blame game is to get it off of your lap and into the lap of anyone else. Now, I can just tell you that as a husband, it's sometimes theoretically, hypothetically possible that when I'm driving the car and I tell my wife to quit navigating for me because I'm the pilot, that when I take a wrong turn, you know whose fault that is? You knew it too, didn't you? It's her fault, right? My wife, who I love more than any other human being, I always say I love Jesus more, but just barely than her, becomes what? The object of my blame. Why? Because I don't want to be at fault. By the way, it works either way. If she speaks and give me direction, she's wrong. If she doesn't speak and give me direction, you were there. She was. I told you she was. They're agreeing with me. They're the only ones that's right. Because the object is to find someone who is at fault. The biggest role that we can play is how do we interrupt? Because no one wins the blame game, everyone loses. There is no, now for a moment, blame may bring a degree of repose, a degree of refreshment, a degree of release. It may be that for the moment, it seems as if we have shirked the responsibility, that we have avoided the consequence, that in that moment of blame, we've won. We got away with it. We won't get caught. And that's not true. So here are the ways that I think that we need to break the blame game if we're going to find the necessary solutions to our problems. Number one, and this is a big one, that is acknowledge fault and take the responsibility. Acknowledge fault and take responsibility. Sometimes it's not the responsibility, it's the consequences that we're trying to avoid, but really it begins before that, which is to look square in the mirror at the only person other than God that you can't lie to because you know the truth, is to say, I did that. Listen carefully. Without acknowledging your guilt in your actions, in your responses, even in your sin, you will not become totally victorious over your problem. It is not uncommon, and I have experienced this in ministerial counseling. I have understood it from those who do professional counseling, that when someone comes in to talk about their problem, rarely do they address the problem. They might address who they think is the problem. That's the blame that is put on someone else. Because my husband is this, because my wife did that, then I have experienced and I behave this way. Or perhaps it is that when they come in for that kind of treatment, that they are unwilling to accept their part or their responsibility. I can illustrate this in one of the very first ministerial counseling experiences I had. Now, I entered into ministry after a full career as a mechanical contractor, and so at about 40, I went into full-time ministry. And I was approached immediately after taking a job with the first church that I worked with by a family that said, boy, do we have some problems. I had only known them a brief period of time, but I agreed. They had all kinds of problems. So I said, well, let's meet. Well, they said, we'd like you to meet with all of us. This was Mom, two of her kids, and Grandma and Grandpa and her brother. She's the one that came to me. So they all came to my office that's small. And they're sitting there in two comfortable chairs, and the rest were in folding chairs. And, of course, I'd been on the job for almost a month. I knew everything, Rick. So I approached this, and I remembered that the first important thing to do was interview them, find out about what's going on. So this was the question that I asked of them. I said, I'd like to go around the room, and you all are here because there is a problem in your family. And what I'd like you to do is, number one, I'd like you to state your problem, and number two, how you have contributed either to the problem or helping to fix the problem. So I gave them an out either way. So I took started with the matriarch of the family, and I said, all right, let's start with you. How do you see the problem? What have you done that has either complicated the problem or trying to fix it? First thing out of our mouth was, well, my daughter. I said, let me just stop for a moment and ask you again, what have you done to either cause the problem, contribute to the problem, or to be a solution to the problem? And she goes, well, my son, and I went, okay, let's move this over, right? Let's move over to the patriarch of the family. He was quiet of the bunch. And I said, if you don't mind, I said, would you state the problem as you see it? Tell me how you've complicated the problem or how you contributed to it or how you've worked to help with it. He goes, well, my wife, and I said, okay, hang on just a second. I restated it. I'm not exaggerating. This is not a preacher story for the sake of illustration. With the exception of the two junior kids, I asked everybody in the room that question. Every single one started with the name or reference to somebody else. I became a little frustrated. I was thinking, kill them all and let God sort it out. Okay, I thought they were all baptized. I wasn't worried about their eternity. God would take care of it. But I got aggravated, and I said, I'm going to ask this question one more time. And I promise you, if you make reference in your answer to somebody else, I'm going to kill you and let God sort it out. That's what I told them. And so I looked to the matriarch. I softened my tone, and I said, I'm going to say her name, Fred, that way I'm safe. Fred, would you please tell me how you envision the problem and what you are doing to either contribute to the problem or contributing? I promise on my dad's grave, but he was cremated and he's dust in the wind now, okay? I promise. She said, my daughter. Now, I'm not a clinician. I'm not professionally trained as a counselor, but I know what the problem was in that family. It was somebody else's fault. And so the beginning of a solution, and most certainly the beginning of a solution that God can provide, is to acknowledge the wrong, the way that you have contributed to the problem, no matter at what degree that is to recognize the guilt or the responsibility that you have. Number two, and this is tough, to accept the consequences of that. That it means that you're going to accept the consequences that are already in motion and perhaps the consequences that come as a result of you admitting it. You see, there, for example, a young girl, she knows better. She finds herself in a compromising situation as a consenting teen, and she ends up pregnant. Now, she can deny it for a while, for a few months. She might even visit a quote-unquote clinic in hopes of alleviating the consequence of it. By the way, consequences aren't always bad, but a consequence of that behavior, but it never relieves her of the guilt of that, meaning she still became pregnant. But the consequences can also continue beyond, like I said, you can only hide that for 3, 4, 5 months, and then somebody goes, you really need to lose some weight. And you're like, yeah, I have a feeling it's going to keep growing, right? But when one admits that, there may be consequences that now come out. The old days that used to be where the girl was sent off to an aunt in the northeastern United States to hide it didn't fix the guilt, and it didn't change the consequences. And now, in a more acceptable model, there are consequences that come along with that. Needless to say, her life is going to change. And so it is a willingness to accept the consequences, because sometimes in our problem being fixed, we're not really want the problem fixed. We just want what? We just want the consequences to go away. We just want the consequences to go away. I have a friend, he makes a good amount of money, and you know what? He doesn't care about speeding. You know why? Because the consequence is something he can handle. He doesn't worry about guilt because he can pay the ticket, hardly misses it. So for some of us, we just like, can I just get let off the hook here, right? Can I just be relieved of the consequences? I'll take the guilt, but I don't want the consequences that come along with it. But this is what begins to turn the tables to the better. And that is simply to begin a process in which we reverse these things. You can't make the pregnant girl unpregnant. You can't make the speeding car now the unspeeding car because it's already broken the law. You can't undo all those things, but what you can do is take it up with the supreme judge of everything. And that is where you begin to say, I need to start with the one who knows my guilt, the one who can help me not just with, but through the consequences, and can provide an escape from the thing that I can't provide an escape from, namely the guilt of sin. God, forgive me. And there is something to be said for that. It's not merely an academic understanding. It's not just some kind of a Christian rationalization. It is a legitimacy that says, I acknowledge my guilt, and I'm not going to have a sinful response to that, but I'm going to take the right response, where a God who is not only capable of forgiving that, but is also capable of beginning to help me work through the consequences of my problem and towards a better life. Do not underestimate the power of the forgiveness of God, not just in a spiritual sense, but in its direct implications in the way your life proceeds going forward. And then, as we mentioned, or as I mentioned in the previous lesson, and that is to take the necessary actions to correct where you can correct. It may be some degree of restitution. It may be crossing the aisles of the congregation to tell somebody, you know what, you and I have been at odds for some time, and I'm taking my part of the responsibility of guilt, and I'm going to take my part in the responsibility of doing whatever I can to fix it. Listen, if God had to leave heaven and give himself for your mistake, you can cross the aisle for somebody else's. And so the opportunity to say, now I'm going to take an action that is redirected now. Does it mean that there's never going to be a mistake? There's never going to be consequences? No. But there is more than just simply, as we will talk about in our next message, and that is the fact that we begin to set ourselves on a new path that has less of those mistakes and thus less of those consequences and more the solution that we have. The Apostle John writes in 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, the one who says he has no sin, and for our purposes I want to expand that, for the one who says I have no responsibility in this, has no responsibility of guilt or no responsibility of correcting things, well, he is lying to the person that he can't lie to, namely himself. John says that the one who says, I do not sin, he deceives himself. In fact, he goes on to say, and you make a God a liar too. But the one who is willing to confess his or her sins has access then to the forgiveness of God that's already been offered. The offer of forgiveness has already been made. There's no I wonder, there's no wish, there's no hope. It's just simply taking hold of that which has been offered. Then there is the forgiveness, and we go on to find the power of God. Listen, I found this. It's an old poem. It was actually in my father's stuff. I would guess it was probably from the mid-'60s, maybe the early '70s, based on the color of the paper and the type that was offered. It said, I went to my psychiatrist to be psychoanalyzed to find out why I killed the cat and blackened both my husband's eyes. He laid me on a downy couch to see what he could find, and there is where he dredged up all sorts of stuff from my subconscious mind. When I was 1, my mommy hid my dolly in a trunk, and so it only follows that naturally I'm always drunk. When I was 2, I saw my father kiss the maid one day, and that is why I suffer from kleptomania. At 3, the feelings of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it follows naturally I poison all of my lovers. But I am happy now. I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is somebody else's fault. The blame game is not the solution to your problem. It only complicates it. It may feel good for a time, but it never resolves the problem. So, I leave you with these questions about your problem as you are facing it today, whatever it may be. Ask yourselves, what are the personal choices that I have made that have contributed to my problem? Great or small, what has been your responsibility of guilt in that regard? Number 2, ask yourselves, have I blamed it on a circumstance, a situation, a politician, an elder, a rich person, a poor person, a family member? Who have I placed blame on, either for the problem or with the expectation that it's their job to fix my problem? Number 3, what is your, and again I'm going to say in light of the things that God shares, what is your responsibility in beginning to correct it? Listen carefully. Even if there is a degree of responsibility that is on someone else for the mess that you're in, ask yourself, since it's your life, what is my responsibility in beginning to fix that? And then finally, what will you do next? A counseling friend of mine says he sits down as the interview process with any new client, any new patient. And he asks them 3 questions, and I think they're really important questions, and it's the 3 questions that I'll close our study with. He says, number 1, are you willing to do whatever it will take to resolve your problem? He told me that he doesn't always have a solution for everybody's problem. His job simply is to give them hope. And those who are conscientious about it, if are given hope, are willing to do anything. So ask them, are you willing to do whatever it would take to solve your problem? Number 2, are you willing to let God be the one that tells you what you need to do? And number 3, are you willing to start right now? He says, I hand that to him on a piece of paper. And they have to check all 3 boxes and sign their name with the date. And if they aren't willing to check all 3 boxes, he said, I tell them, then I can't help you. If you're not willing to do whatever it takes, if you're not willing to let God be the one that tells you what you need to do, and you're not willing to start right now. So that's going to be our mandate, our mantra, if you will, for the rest of these sessions is, will we let God tell us what to do to resolve our problems and be willing to do it, whatever it takes, and then begin right now if we want to find those resolutions. Thanks for staying around. I appreciate that we fixed the nobody sitting up front problem. We just moved the pulpit back. But that was nice. I don't know if you know this. That's a courtesy that's often paid to visiting preachers, to leave the front 4 rows open for all the responses that are expected at the invitation. So we didn't use those up, but we'll use those later in the week. I hope you'll come back tonight and Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. As I said, hopefully our lessons are valuable in and of themselves, but I want them to be progressive as well. And I guarantee you don't want to miss what's going to happen on Wednesday, because that's the most hope that I can give you. Oops, maybe I gave away it. Let's close with a word of prayer. Thanks for being here. You guys have a great afternoon. Father, we're guilty. We know that we have been guilty before you, and we know that we have contributed to some of the problems in our lives. And before we cast the blame on others, the blame on our circumstances, or even the blame on you, Father, I pray that we'll begin to make things clean and clear by simply accepting not just the responsibility or the guilt, or not simply the consequences, but that we recognize that that's the process that leads us to a recognition and an acknowledgement of your forgiveness that is available to us. And that though some things may remain, that it has put us in a good place with you, and that produces value in this life and the life that is to come. I'm thankful for this church and its desire to strengthen the saints and to share the good news of Jesus with its community. I'm thankful for the efforts that were given yesterday in Vacation Bible School, the efforts that are already being put into the youth rally here in a couple of weeks, and beyond that, an opportunity to strengthen marriages and families. I pray that you bless this church because of their desire to serve you in our world today. I'm thankful for everybody who is here today, as it was not simply a rote habit, but it is a desire to collectively come together and to encourage one another, to lift their voices in praises to you, to hear your word and your guidance, and to remember what your Son did for all of us on the cross. Continue to care for us this afternoon, and my prayer is that you will make it clear for all of us to return again this evening. Father, we thank you for your many blessings, none more so than Jesus Christ. And it is in his name that I pray on our behalf.